All right, and here we go. Right, Moises Goldman and Sherry Maysonave, thank you very much. I appreciate you guys joining me for the podcast. I've been looking forward to this conversation since I booked it because it's such an amazing story. So thank you both.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Moises, going to start with you. If you would just, we'll talk about the book a little bit later on. If you could just start by telling a little bit about your mother's upbringing, where she was born, where she was brought up, just to give us a little background about where she came from.
She came from Poland. She was born in a small place called Zelum, Poland, and which it was like a shtetl. That's what we called it in Yiddish. It's a small town where there is a lot of Jewish people, farmers, etc., etc. If you saw Fiddler on the roof, something similar to that, maybe a little bit more uh, contemporaneous.
And how old was your mother when World War II broke out?
When World War II broke out, my mom was somewhere between the 17th and the 18th year of age.
And how many children in her family, and where did she fit in? Was she an older child, a middle child?
She was one of 11, and she had six older brothers and one older sister that migrated to the Americas. The sister, the oldest one, ended up in New York City, and the other six brothers went to Mexico City.
Oh wow! So they were far and wide.
Yep.
Now, when
Ninth born of 11.
ninth of 11. Wow,
Ninth of 11.
wow, that's amazing. So, at what point during the war, how far into it, was she taken to Auschwitz, and how many of her siblings were also taken with her?
You're asking me?
Yes.
Okay. My mother, her younger brother Joel, her two younger sisters, Rachel and Sarah, they were taken away from their home. They went to the ghetto, and then they spent almost 3 years in the ghetto, and then somewhere around, I believe, December 7th of 1942, they moved them into a train, and the train went to Auschwitz.
And what were, from what you learned from her tapes and so on, and for people who aren't aware of what the ghettos were like, what were the conditions like at that time in those ghettos?
The conditions were very bad. My mom, along with her father and mother and the two younger sisters, they moved them into a one-room mill, which was already occupied by another family. So they have the one-room mill between the other family and them, and they were there for almost 3 years.
And
Ed Scott, they had no furniture and no kitchen. It was an old abandoned mill. And they came in a little bit later. The ghetto was already full with its regular housing when the Mondlak family came in.
so it was an actual former working mill that
Yes.
they were forced to live in.
Yes.
Wow. Wow. And what happened to your mom's parents during the wartime?
Both of my grandparents, they die in the ghetto. My Bobby, my grandmother, She fainted when she found out that they moved my mother into a jail within the ghetto, and she cracked her sternum. And obviously, even an aspirin was very hard to find, and so she died after cracking her sternum. My grandfather, a few months later, was the Gestapo came into the mill, and they took him out and they shot him in the back of the head.
Wow. So I'm just trying to picture what your grandmother went through. Obviously, cracking a sternum is very painful. No medical attention, obviously, no painkillers. So
No,
that must have been unbelievable agony for her.
If I
yes,
could say, they transported her, one of the Gestapo transported her to the ghetto hospital, but she received no treatment there. They didn't even clean her up. She had no medication at all.
Mm, wow. And so we'll move forward a bit. So that was a good little bit of background. So I'll just ask you, Sherry, now to let you chime in. So how did you become associated with Moises and his family and get involved in the project of the book?
Well, I guess I could say that Providence shined a light on me on an afternoon when my husband, Stephen Maysonave, met Moises through a business associate, and they struck up an accord and then decided to get the wives together. And then we met for dinner, and Moises began telling me about his mother's story, which was appalling and also inspiring, but so horrendous.
Mm,
And since I was an author, had published multiple books, we began talking about. He wanted his mother's story. It was his dream to have his mother's story told in a public way, and through a book initially.
interesting. It's crazy how sometimes fate brings the right people into your life to accomplish what you want to accomplish.
Yes.
Moises, so let's talk about the tapes. Your mom was obviously ill at the time, and you can tell the story about her illness and her recording the tapes. So, at what point did you find out? Uh, did you know she was recording these tapes as she was doing it, or did you find out afterwards?
I well, let me give you a little bit of background. In January of 1985, she was diagnosed terminal by the MD Anderson in Houston. They gave her about 3 to 4 months to live. At that point in time, she requested a tape player, a cassette tape player, and she started taping those tapes. She taped 11 45-minute tapes of her life. Now, I was living at the time in Chicago. I started a new job there, but I was pretty high in the executive chain. So every 2 weeks, I will fly down to Mexico and I will see her for Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, and then I would fly Sunday night or Monday morning back to Chicago. And I did that for quite some time. And my mom recorded those tapes, and when I went down to Mexico to visit with her, well, she was recording at times, but and I knew she was recording about her life, but I did not have any idea of why she was doing it until I listened to the tapes, and then I found out.
You said that she was given 3 to 4 months at the time when she decided to record those tapes.
Right.
So, how long after that 3 to 4 month diagnosis did she pass?
Actually, my mom went into a coma right after, I will say within a week or so from recording her 11th tape. I don't know if she was going to record a 12th tape or whatever, but that's when she went into a coma. And she lasted in a coma for about 2 weeks, and then she died on May 5th of 1985.
Now, Moises, if you could just tell the story about, was it your father that almost urged her to record,
No,
or
no,
was?
no, on the contrary, my father was very much against talking about the Holocaust when I was growing up in Mexico. He didn't like talking about the Holocaust. My mom, on the other hand, every time she got a chance, she will blurb something out about her experience in the Holocaust.
It's funny how that works with people, and you can both talk to this. If you talk, soldiers, like modern soldiers, anyone that's been through anything traumatic, some people like to talk, not like to talk about it, but some people are willing to talk about it. Some people will just lock it away and not say a word about it. And that sounds like there was that kind of dichotomy between your mother and father as well.
Yeah, there was that dichotomy, and but how should I say this? I had the tapes for quite a long time, and but every time I tried to listen to the tapes, uh, I just couldn't. Probably 5 minutes, and I will start crying like a baby, and because I will hear my mom alive. When I
Mm-hmm.
moved to Austin, Texas, uh, I was semi-retired at the time that I moved, so I started listening to the tapes, and that's when I realized, my gosh, this is not just a story. This is something very big. A lot of travails, a lot of adventure. Sherry can tell you more about it because uh, she's very detailed in her explanations, and but after I listened to the tapes, like Sherry said, I met with Steven for lunch, and I said to him, I have those tapes. I listened to them. This is not just a biography of my mom. This can be a novel, something very, very big. And that's when Stephen all of a sudden said to me, "Do you know my wife is a very famous writer?" And I said, "Oh my gosh." So that's when I met Sherry. Sherry, I this was almost 4 years ago, right, Sherry?
Yes. Well, I think, yeah, a little over 4 years ago. Yes.
A little bit over 4 years ago.
Mhm.
I think that Sherry asked me for two transcriptions or three transcriptions of the tapes, and after she read the transcriptions, she says, "I'm in," and that's how we started.
And Sherry, so you read the transcripts of the tapes. Have you heard the actual tapes, or are they not in a language that are they not in an English?
No, they were not in English. They were in Spanish and Yiddish, and I speak un poquito Spanish. So Moises translated and transcribed them. And yes, after reading them, I literally heard the voice of my soul that Hinda Mondlak Goldman, she was a heroine not only of just not only of the Holocaust, I mean, not only of Auschwitz, but an absolute heroine of the Holocaust. She had an unbreakable spirit that is, and I love words, but it's hard to describe her amazing, unbreakable spirit.
And that spirit obviously continued until her last days, because obviously, if you're given 3 to 4 months to live, I I can speak for myself that, there'd be a million things going through my head, and to have the internal strength to say, okay, I'm going to use these last few months that I have to record this story, so that other people can read it. That alone takes an incredible amount of strength.
Fortitude and strength and just willpower. I'm sure she was feeling physically terrible and had little strength to do that. But that was Hinda. She would do that, for sure.
And
And,
as you
and she had the impetus from the letter her father wrote to her the day that he was killed by the Gestapo, and that he said, "I know for certain you will live and you will tell." And he like willed her to survive and tell this story. And so I think that was on her heart as well. Those words were emblazoned upon her heart, and she felt it was time to now really tell her story.
And as Sherry, as you're reading these transcripts, not that it's like we've all had that book that we just can't put down and that we want to keep reading. Obviously, this wasn't for entertainment, but you must have found that just incredibly riveting to read.
I did, and riveting and appalling. I started having nightmares, of soldiers bursting into my home and taking, me and my family and confiscating all of our goods in our home. I mean, I started having the nightmares, really living and feeling what she was experiencing. And I will say that as I read Moises's translations, and when I started writing, Hinda would fill the room. Her spirit just filled the room, surrounded me. And I think she should be named as an author too.
Absolutely. Moises, so on an earlier episode of my podcast, I interviewed a gentleman from Scotland who was the victim as a young boy of sexual abuse. And I asked him, I said, how did you sit down to write this book? Because dredging up those terrible memories must have been really difficult as you're trying to put those words onto paper. And he basically said he could write maybe a page or a couple of pages or a few pages, and then he had to set it aside because it was just too much for him. Is that how it was for you when you were listening to your mom's tapes?
When I listened to my mom's tapes, because they were done in a sequential basis, I died with her. I literally died with her. And then at the end of the 11th tape, sort of like I said to myself, if she is brave enough to put those words into the tapes, I'm gonna be brave enough to get. Basically, what I did is I promised my mother to finish up what her father promised to her. That was my promise to my mom. And
Let's uh,
actually, after the 11th tape, I think I got as brave as my mom did, and the rest is right there. Sherry did a marvelous work, marvelous work.
well, the beauty of, if you can find beauty in such a story, is the passing on of, your mom wanted to fulfill her father's last wishes, you wanted to fulfill your mother's last wishes. So, even among all the horror and the tragedy of what took place, there's a beauty in that part of it where you can fulfill your mother's wishes and she fulfilled her father's.
Yeah, yeah. When the book was finished, I felt a tremendous amount of satisfaction that I did what I promised my mom I was going to do, and what basically my grandfather promised to her too. So my grandfather's promise to her was my promise to my mom.
Hmm. And let's touch a little bit. I don't want to get too much into too many stories about her time at Auschwitz. People will read the book. Um, how how surreal is it to hear those tapes, hear those stories, and think, "Wow, this is my mother that went through this." It almost must be hard to believe.
It was totally surreal. For me, it was very painful and very surreal. But it's funny, at the end of the 11th tape, I just felt like my mom, like my mother, very strong of spirit, and my mom was a very brave woman.
Absolutely. And she's passed that on to you. I like to think of it that way, that as you were listening to those tapes, she was giving you the strength to listen all the way through and carry out this project.
Well, my mom always was my best friend and my guiding light. My father was very disciplinarian with me, and that's when I needed to do something. I would go to my mom for permission, because if I went to my dad and he said no, that was the end of it.
Mm-hmm. And Sherry, so working on the book, how long did it take from start to finish, your part of putting this book together?
Well, Scott, it was 4 full years, and some of
Mm-hmm.
that includes editing and rewrites, but it was 4 full years, full time, working on this. And it just, it was truly a massive project because I I yearned for Hinda's story to be widely read, and I wanted it to bring it so alive on the written page that the reader experienced firsthand what she and her family were experiencing, that they were there living that too. And so that took it took a lot of thought in just how to get that onto the written page into a full book. We decided to create two subplots: a doctor that saved Tinda's life when she had malaria at Auschwitz, Walter Zielhofen, and then I don't want to give too much away in the story, but another character, Wolf Jaskowitz, who turned out to be very prominent in Hinda and Moises's life. And so creating those two subplots also made the book a little more complex, but I also think a lot more readable. Many of the readers have told us they appreciated those subplots because Hinda's story is just so horrendous that they needed some rest from that.
Mm-hmm. So Moises, amongst all the horror of Auschwitz, and through your mother's words on her tapes, were there a lot of stories of, let's say, the good side of humanity? People helping people in Auschwitz as much as they possibly could. Were there bright lights in that, or was it just everyone trying to deal with a horrific situation as best that they possibly could?
Well, you heard Sherry talking about the subplots of Dr. Walter, which we never knew his last name, and Sherry came with the word Seinhofen for his last name. But and I think that we argue at the beginning whether Walter was a Jewish doctor or a Nazi doctor or whatever. I don't know if you remember, Sherry, that the part. And
Well, I remember from your mother's tapes that he was a Catholic, so it wasn't likely that he was Jewish.
No, the
Yes.
point was that in none of the tapes, my mother said Walter is a German doctor. She never said that in the tapes.
Okay.
She always referred to Walter as Dr. Walter at the concentration camp, blah, blah, blah. So I figure that the fact that she did not say whether Walter was German or not, I figure he was German, you know.
Now, you'll correct me if I'm wrong on this, but did your mother help one of her sisters to escape from Auschwitz?
Yes, my mom became a mother and my father to her two younger sisters. Rachel was 6 years younger than her, and Sarah was 10 years younger than her. When they went through the selection, she couldn't uh, help Sarah. Sarah died in the crematoriums right away, but during the chaos, uh, she pulled Rachel from one line towards her line, which was and that's how she saved Rachel.
And at what year when was that they escaped?
19 oh the escape,
Yes.
January 1945, the first week in January 1945.
Okay. And so we'll move a little bit forward. So after they escaped from Auschwitz, where did they go then? What happened next?
Well, they found themselves in the rural area near Auschwitz, just miles from Auschwitz, and they jumped on. It was snowing very, very hard, and they had low visibility. They jumped on a trailer with hay on it, and they hid in the hay. The driver had hidden his coat in the hay, so he stops because it's freezing, and the snow has turned more wet. And he gets out and he discovers them there, and he locks them in a barn and plans to take them back to Auschwitz the next morning. But Hinda finds an escape route out of the barn, and amazingly, and they walk a kilometer or kilometer and a half. It's very early in the morning, still dark, 4 in the morning, and they find a two-story home that had a light on, and they went there, and they were allowed to stay there for a week, and that's an entire story too, where they were going to be kicked out, but Hinda's boldness once again. Some people are bold and they're stupid. Hinda was bold and she was brilliant. She knew she could think so quickly on her feet, and she knew how to assess a situation and read people. And so she spoke with this family, Mr. Mielik, the head of the family, Mr. Mielik, and he took her to the barn, and she told him the whole story, that they were escapees from Auschwitz. And he then let them stay for 1 week, but 1 week only.
Mm-hmm.
And so then from there, a Gestapo officer takes them, and then they end up staying in his home for like 6 weeks. And then they're kicked out of there, and they're on to stay in an elderly couple's home in very rural. She wasn't even sure where they were at that point. So many lines had been redrawn with the war.
Mm-hmm.
And it goes on and on. They had so many interesting, intriguing travails. And many times it was the kindness of others that saved them, but it was always because of Hinda's courage.
So an officer with the Gestapo gave them shelter for.
Yes. Yes.
Wow.
This is fascinating. It's because this shows you how smart Hinda was, in that she told him that she could help save him from the Russians, because at that point the Red Army was approaching that area.
Right, because this was 45, right?
Yes, and the Red Army actually freed Auschwitz in, I think, January 25th of 1945. So they were approaching that area, and the German people were very afraid of the Russians coming in and taking them over. And she convinced him, showing him her Auschwitz tattoo, that if she showed the Russians that, because they wanted to take Hitler down, that they would then, if she told him that the Gestapo officer and his family, the Almoses, had been very kind to them and had saved her life and protected her, that they would then not kill him.
Hey, everybody, this is Scott, the host of the Sunday Morning Coffee Podcast. I would like to invite you to support the show through our Patreon page at patreon.com/smcpod. That's patreon.com/smcpod, where for only $4 per month, you can get early access to episodes and members-only content. Once again, that's patreon.com/smcpod, and I thank you for your support. Wow.
That's how smart she was.
That's amazing. And she's a teenage girl at the time.
Well, she is, this is 1945. She was born in 1921. So
it was almost 24 or 24.
20,
right.
Mm-hmm.
But still, to have that wherewithal at that age while going through all of that and trying to save your life and your sister's life, that's
right.
Incredible.
Remember, they were malnourished. They had been starved for years and years and years. So, you get brain fog typically with such severe malnourishment, but she still was able to somehow think clearly.
And as you mentioned earlier that they escaped, they saw the home with the light on. She had no idea who was in that home.
No.
That could have been anybody. That could have been another Nazi officer. That could have just dragged them back.
Right.
But you've got to take the chance, right? Like you've got to.
And that's was Hinda. She was always willing to take the chance.
And so after the war ends, Moises, where does your mother go after the war ends?
Oh, she ended up in a place called Breslau, which at that particular point in time, I think was part of Germany, but before that was Polish. And then the Germans, they returned Breslau to Poland. And I think that the Polish name is Rolak or something like that for Breslau. And
it's Wrocław.
Excuse me?
Wrocław, I believe. Mm-hmm.
Sherry knows how to speak Polish better than I. But that's where she met my father in Breslau. And 2 weeks later or so, after she met my father said to my mom, maybe you're not in love with me, but I will take care of you for the rest of my life. And
that's what happened.
Oh, he proposed a very romantic, beautiful proposal under a full moon. So, yeah.
Oh, yeah. That's great. And so, Moises, where did your parents, after they met and were together, where did they spend the majority of their lives together?
In Mexico City.
In Mexico?
Yeah. My mother tried to get in touch with her brothers. One of the brothers, Jack, which was maybe, he always said he was younger than my mom, but that's not true. He was like two years older than her. Got in contact with my mom. They proposed to meet in Paris. So my mom, her sister Rachel, and the two husbands at the time, they went to Paris. They waited for my Uncle Jack to get there. Jack was already very well connected in Mexico City from a political point of view. He was a political journalist.
Hmm.
So he got them to the passports. Actually, he got three passports for my mom, Rachel, and her husband, and my father, Wolf Yoskovich. Did not get a passport, but my uncle Jack told my father that there was a visa there for somebody called Samuel Goldman. If he was able to take that name, then they all could move to Mexico. And that's how Wolf Yoskovich became Samuel Goldman.
Hmm.
And so that was his legal name in Mexico City, but his friends always called him Wolf, and my mother called him Wolf. And but to the employees and or to his business associates, he was Don Samuel uh, Samuel Goldman.
And were you born in Mexico
Yeah,
City
I
as
was
well?
born in Mexico in 1949.
Okay. And Moises, obviously, as time goes on, there are fewer and fewer people left to tell these type of stories. And as we have seen unfortunately, from current events, um, these are still stories that have to be told so that we don't repeat them again. How important do you think it is to keep obviously, it's your mother. It's an incredible story. What do you think of the importance of keeping these stories alive for those reasons? Because uh, if we don't tell these stories, then we're bound to repeat the terrible things that happened in the past.
A friend of mine that read the book said to me the other day, uh, that book that of your mom, it should be read by the next generation so they will not forget or will make the same mistakes that the previous one did.
Hmm. And Sherry, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think we're living in a time that is quite alarming with the possibility of history repeating itself. In the past few years, well, when we saw unprompted invasion into Ukraine by a dictator, and now we've seen an unprompted attack on Israel with more Jews slaughtered in one day than since the times of the Holocaust. And 6 million Jews were killed in the Holocaust, 14 million people total, including the Romanis and homosexuals and anyone considered to be, um, you know,
Not fit. Not
yeah,
fit.
not part of, not somehow an aberration from what was quote unquote considered normal at that time, which is, an absurd thought, but prevalent at that time. So to me, it's alarming. It's very alarming. And it's also shocking how many young people really don't know about what happened in the Holocaust and the unjust persecution of the Jews. And so it's very frightening to see what's happening in today's world with the rise of anti-Semitism and the attacks. So I think education is key, and I think raising the awareness of what did happen in the Holocaust. My hope and prayer, and I know it's Moises's too, that by reading this book and that heightened awareness of what really did happen would encourage people to take a stand so that this never happens again. And I mean, that was said a lot, never again. Dwight Eisenhower and, so many said that, never again. But we see never again playing out on our world stage right now.
And one of the most horrifying thing to me, other than the attacks themselves, and it happened, I know it happened here, I know it happened in cities in the United States, is people out on the street basically celebrating those attacks and calling them resistance fighters and all of this other absolute nonsense. How this is probably too big of a question for any of us to answer, but how did we get to that point where people are celebrating these types of things?
I think that is a huge question, and I fear that we've become so polarized in such an identity-based society that there's been a contribution there, and then I think there's a factor of the video games that are so popular right now, where you kill people and you celebrate, and you behead people and you celebrate, and it's almost like we've gone back to a medieval type of mentality. But that's a huge question, Scott. It's just more than we can begin to answer here. But I am fearful of the identity politics that's so prevalent right now, rather than seeing people as people and see their suffering with them.
I agree with you on that polarization, because it seems like if you say, oh boy, the sun's really hot today, there's going to be 100 people that are screaming, no, it's not. And it's absolutely ridiculous and I think social media has probably played a huge part in this, because, there's that ability to say pretty much whatever you want to somebody without any fear of any kind of retribution or consequences for that. And I think that's played a huge part as well in this whole kind of shift that we've seen.
Yes, I agree with that. Mm-hmm.
So when did the book come out? Who published it? Just give us some details. And I'll ask again as well the title of the book. So if you just tell us, and I'll start with you, Sherry. Tell us about the book.
Sure. Well, here we have the book, and it's Tatae's Promise. And it's based on a true story. Now, this is historical fiction, but it is based on a true story of a young woman's escape from Auschwitz. And that young woman is Hinda Mondlak. And it's an appalling story, but also very inspiring. And it was published by Dark Frog Books. Gordon McClellan is the publisher there. It's Dark Frog Blue, which is a traditional publishing brand there. And it came out September, or maybe late August of 2023. So it's brand new.
Nice. So Sherry, let me ask about, you say it's obviously based on a true story. How hard is it in a case like this to add that fictional element while doing justice to the true story? There's got to be a really fine balance to be had there.
Well, thank you for asking that question, because I think it's important for readers to know. And we do have an afterword that goes through the facts and fiction, exactly what was fact and what was fiction, and very, very little is fiction. Because everything that's in the story, even if it's not based from Hinda's tapes, was based on accounts that I read from the Holocaust. So everything that's in the book did happen to someone during that time. But mainly, it follows Hinda's story, and there's very few fictional aspects. We had to shore up some of what happened to Wolf Jaskowitz, Moises' father. We didn't know a lot about his life prior to he was imprisoned at the Buchenwald concentration camp. And we didn't know a lot about his survival when the war started between those times. So there's a fictional family that was brought in to support his survival. But we outline that in the afterword, clearly telling the reader what was fact and what was fiction.
Right. So it's not really fiction for the sake of it. It's more to fill in gaps where information might not have been available.
Yes, correct. And even this was based on some fact in that Wolf's parents, they owned a flour mill, and he worked in the flour mill from the time he was 10 years old. And he delivered flour to bakeries. And so the family, the fictional family, owned a bakery in town and had a farm outside of town. And they were very good to Wolf and helped him survive. So they were a fictional tool for his survival, and also a fictional tool to show that a lot of properties and farms in particular were confiscated by the Third Reich government during that time because they wanted to instill the German culture into Poland. And so they would just confiscate a property and move a family out. And so that the Duca family, that is a fictional family in this story, they also, provided an avenue to show that. But that's historical. That's fact. So,
Moises,
Yes.
go ahead. No, go ahead. If you had something to add.
Can you repeat the question, please?
Sure. So I just wanted to ask you, at the end of this entire process, listening to the tapes, working with Sherry to get this book written, what was it like for you when you finally saw the finished product? You see that finished book that Sherry just held up. That must have been there must have been a lot of conflicting emotions for you when you see that finally in print.
Actually, I felt very, very proud of Sherry, of the book. She's a tremendous partner, and the book for me was an accomplishment. People ask me how is the book doing in Amazon. I answered them. I really don't check because the book is done. So I accomplished what I promised my mom, and to me, that's more than enough.
Yeah, it wasn't about selling X number of copies or anything like that. It was about your mom's wishes.
Well, it's not the selling, because unfortunately things are correlated. I want people to read it, so therefore, the book has to sell. But for me, the primary objective is for people to read the story of my mom.
Absolutely. Well, I'm looking forward to getting a copy of it myself. I'm looking forward to reading that. So I just want to thank you both for spending some time with me this evening. It's an incredible story. It could be a movie. Just the story you told about the escape was absolutely incredible. And I'm picturing that as a movie in my head. It's just almost the stuff of Hollywood, but what your mom sounded like an incredible woman. And I'm very happy that you got to fulfill her wish for her. So Moises and Sherry, thank you very much for your time tonight. I'm be happy to spread the word about the book as much as I can and get as many people to read it as possible.
thank you, Scott. We certainly
Thank you so very much.
Yes.
Thank you.